Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Stories of Music. One day late, but still glad you could join us. We're continuing our look at the history of Canadian rock music. This week, it's all about the 80s. Now, like the two previous decades that we've looked at, the 80s really can be divided up by some pretty major events. The first one was probably the development of music television, music videos. 1981, MTV hit the air in the States. 3 years later, 1984, Much Music started broadcasting from Toronto. Funny side note with these two, MTV in the States, they actually went with a British band, the Buggles, for their very first song broadcast. Of course, video killed the radio star. Up here in Canada, we chose to stay a little bit homegrown. The first video broadcast in the summer of '84 on Much Music was actually Rush's The Enemy Within from the album Grace Under Pressure. That happens to be this album right here. Regardless, the effect of these two networks was to really expand the exposure to new music for the average person. Now, besides just broadcasting the videos themselves, up here in Canada, the group behind Much Music, Chum City basically, they also developed the fund Video Fact, and that was a fund that artists could draw from to actually film the videos themselves, further increasing their exposure. Now, in the mid-'80s, we had moved on from the styles of the '70s for a most part. You started seeing more heavy metal, glam rock, what was called New Wave, and up here in Canada, you would see that in artists like Platinum Blonde, Parachute Club, Helix, one of my favorite artists from Montreal, Men Without Hats, and all of these bands used videos specifically to increase their exposure. Along with the music videos, you also had a lot more portable music. By that I mean in-car cassette players became in-car CD players. You also had the rise of the Sony Walkman. Later on, Discman came along, and all of these devices just increased the amount of Canadian music that was being enjoyed by the average person. And of course, Canadian music would also spread, we would say virally nowadays, because of these devices and these technologies. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, and certainly in the early 80s, a lot of the popular music that was around was more of a generic pop rock. This was the stuff that was popular on the top 40 charts, and certainly if you wanted to find a lot of success in places like the States, you had to stay with a very generic pop style. Now, by the time the late 80s came along, there were enough artists out there that you started to see genres actually start to fill in. So, for example, with alt-rock, especially again at the end of the 80s, you had bands like Spirit of the West and Tragically Hip. In blues rock, we were represented by people like Jeff Healey and David Wilcox. Stomping Tom Connors, probably one of the most famous Canadian artists in music there ever was, with folk rock. And also there were enough thrash rock, industrial, really heavy metal rock, especially coming out of centers like Montreal, where they really started to develop that Canadian industry. Now, I did mention an act like Tragically Hip. They would go on to have more influence in the next decade, in the 90s, and that's what we're going to talk about starting next week. Now, because the 90s is a pretty broad subject and there's lots to talk about, we're actually going to split it into a few weeks and talk about a number of bands and what influence they had on that decade. So please join us next week for our first week look at the 90s. We're going to drive down to the local record shop and talk about a band that is really one of my favorites. and certainly helped tell the story of the 90s when it comes to Canadian music. Thanks for joining us this week. We will see you next week for that. Bye for now.